In today's session, the the main focus when we're speaking about overcoming fragmentation in the youth-led philanthropy sector, and I'll go into a little detail why I think Impact the Youth was invited to also speak on this topic in a moment. But the two things I wanted to focus on in this presentation are frameworks and tools for rethinking. I think from a theoretical perspective and from a urgency perspective, we all recognize that the role of youth in the philanthropy sector and in society more broadly is extremely important, and that without young people, neither this sector nor any other sector will be able to succeed. But at the heart of the matter is, how do we engage youth? What is the best way to engage youth in any sector, but specifically within philanthropy? And how do we navigate the positionality of being a young person who is trying to either be a philanthropist, support philanthropy organizations, or somehow create impact using philanthropy as a tool? So I just want to make sure that you are all seeing my screen and that it's actually moving to the next slide. So I've now moved to slide 2. If you're not seeing slide 2, just give me a shout. So it's a bit embarrassing when you're halfway through your presentation and someone points out, actually, you are not moving in your slides. So if it's not moved for you, just give it a thumbs up or something so we know. Just a bit of background about Impacting Youth. So Impacting Youth is a social impact enterprise registered here in South Africa, but we also work with clients and stakeholders around the world, and specifically in our region, to basically improve the level of youth engagement and youth strategic thinking in our region, but also in different sectors. The theory of change behind this is obviously that if we help organizations to work with young people better, to equip young people better, then young people benefit, but society as a whole benefits as well. And so our work includes things around youth impact research, youth engagement strategies, program design, come from the other sectors that we work in as well, including civil society, including academia, including with some government stakeholders, because ultimately the problems we are trying to solve are intersectoral problem, or as some people like to say, they're sector agnostic. And that we have to come together and actually think of solutions. So our organization sort of sits at the intermediary of those conversations, bringing the right kind of stakeholders together. Some of the stakeholders, as I've said, from different sectors, key of which for this conversation also being philanthropy support organizations, and networks. I think as I start off, I want to just do a little bit of framing around the conversation today. When we speak about fragmentation in youth-led philanthropy, the temptation when we speak about young people is to just speak about young people. And we neglect the fact that young people are also, they're members of society, they're members of community, and they're a specific kind of stakeholder group. So in the same way that when we speak about women, we don't just speak about, women issues, we speak about women in science or women in, technology or in STEM or in any of those fields, because we recognize that, yes, they are women and so their experience is unique, but they are members of society. And so in the same way, when we speak about youth, we sometimes put it a little bit on a pedestal. So what I like to do is to break it down and put it in an intergenerational context, because that's the framework in which we can really understand who are the young people, how did they come about, and how do they interact with other generations. The important thing about our society today, which is perhaps for the first time in human history, we have this situation where at scale, there are multiple generations moving and working side by side in different sectors, not only in philanthropy, but across the board in government and private sector. In previous times, there used to be a sort of pyramid structure in your society where you would have a majority young people, and then they would get less and less as people got older because people just didn't live as long. And so you'd have a very small group of elders who could be, the guardians and the leaders of society. Now with modern medicine and modern technology and so on, people are living longer, especially post maybe the 1900s. And so now what we have is societies where there are multiple generations all competing for leadership, all competing for influence within the same period. So when we look, for example, at this diagram that I'm representing here, when we speak about young people today, we're often speaking about your Gen Zs, so those who were born between 1997 and 2012. So those are the young people who are also now, most of them are studying. The youngest of them are now finishing high school, but most of them are studying or they're entering the work field. They're in entry-level positions. And then we're also looking, if we take the definition of a young person being between the ages of 15 and 35, which is the African Union's definition, we're also looking at some of the younger millennials, or what we call Gen Y. So the millennial category is a little bit broken up between those who are much more senior, who are already considered out of the youth bracket, and those younger ones who are still a little bit in the youth bracket. So when we speak about young people, we're talking about those age groups. But in our society, and specifically in the philanthropy sector, those are the people who are entering in the entry level, and maybe some of them are in the managerial level of philanthropic organizations and so on. But in reality, the people leading, the board members, the directors, those kind of guys are either very senior millennials or they come from a generation we call Gen X, those who are now in their maybe mid 50s to mid 60s. Some of them are already retired, but they're the ones who are really making the decisions about where philanthropy goes, and how philanthropy operates and the systems that get adopted or rejected. And the important thing to also note here is that they themselves also inherited systems and ways of thinking and processes that they didn't necessarily create. And so that brings us even further back into history to the time of the baby boomers. Now, the interesting thing about the baby boomers is that the baby boomers were the generation right after World War II. So the world was in a state of flux. We had the World War. In many places in the global south, colonialism was busy receding and falling out of fashion, and there was a lot of liberation movements rising up. So it was a time of great turmoil. So the baby boomers, especially the most senior ones, actually played a key role in building what we call today the multilateral architecture of the world. You know, your World Banks, your IMF. They built a lot of the nation state governments that we now have, both in our region, a lot of the liberation movement that started at that point, that gained liberation and started government, but also in the global north, in the US and Europe. This was a time of great unrest and turmoil. And so the world that they built, including the philanthropy world, was based on certain principles. Obviously, a big focus of philanthropy and international aid during that time was about building up nations, building up governments, reconstruction after the disaster of the Second World War. In the global south, it was about reconstruction after the disaster of colonialism and trying to establish governments and nations. And so that shaped a lot about how societies thought about how they should use their resources, including in the philanthropic sector. The idea that international aid, first it went to Europe to rebuild Europe, and then it shifted to the global south, that you could rebuild entire societies on a certain sort of set map, or a certain set model, and you could just copy and paste that across the whole world. We knew that by the time of the 1970s and 80s that that model wasn't really working, and that there were more complicated issues in the global south. And so philanthropy also changed a bit. But the interesting thing to note here that I just want to point out is that each of these generations, their view of philanthropy and how it should work was very much shaped by the reality around them, and it was in response to it. But even though we are facing new challenges today as people, you know, young millennials or Gen Zs, we are still using the same mindsets that the baby boomers established in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And the reason for this is because those in power have continued to shape the world, and they have continued to use those frameworks, with the Gen Xers maybe coming in and playing a more managerial role, sort of just continuing that same system. It's only when we get to the millennials that the world started to really break down, the post-World War II world, where we had things like 9/11, which was a serious break in the global community's idea of what security was, to show that a nation like the United States could be targeted by a nation that was so far away, by a group, a non-state actor group, which is something that wasn't really in the framework of people in the post-World War era. Similarly, with the 2007 and 8 financial crisis, it showed that the global economic system was not as resilient, the one that had been built after the Second World War, and that a new approach was needed. So we see this manifesting in philanthropy as well, in the way that millennials began to think a lot more about maybe we shouldn't just think about how can things like international aid build up the economy in the more traditional sense, but how are we dealing with non-state actors? And here we also see the influx and the influence of things like NGOs and NGO networks starting to influence global policymaking at the UN and those kind of spaces. And so there was this optimism that if we included more people, that we would be able to solve the problems quicker. What we now see with Gen Zs, obviously Gen Z's experience of things like philanthropy, but also things like social impact, is shaped by the aftermath of things like the 2008 financial crisis and the post, sort of what we could call the post West world, where the global South is now rising up and has greater autonomy and can authentically stand in its own space and wants to have its voice heard. But there's now sort of this resistance against the system that was, and those who refuse to see its failures. And so what we see in Gen Zs is both a greater sense of social consciousness, but also a resistance against doing it the way that it's already been done. So alignment with values is very important for Gen Zs. They look at philanthropy as more than just money. I mean, if you look at the way that Gen Zs traditionally, mostly because they don't necessarily have their own, access to resources yet, so philanthropy looks a bit different for them. But the amount of volunteering that Gen Z does, I mean, if we just look at research that's currently being done, some would say that up to 80% of Gen Zs are involved in some kind of philanthropic initiative where they're giving their time and their energy towards a cause that they believe in. And so this myth that, young people are disinterested, that they don't want to engage in the processes is not true. They're just creating alternative processes because on the one hand, they don't want to engage in the traditional processes, but on the other, we see Gen Z uprisings and movements all around the world that are changing governments. And so there's this contradiction that youth philanthropy and philanthropy more broadly needs to think about where are the young people and how do they want to be engaged. And the reason I also lay this out in this way is because the fragmentation that exists in the youth philanthropy sector and in the philanthropy sector more broadly can only really be solved with intergenerational leadership. And this is why in the beginning, when I said that if you're just focusing on youth-led philanthropy and you just focus on youth, that's only a part of the picture. Because ultimately, if we don't bring all generations together to have a conversation about the role of young people or Gen Zs in the future of philanthropy, then we'll continue to have a siloed and fragmented approach. The opportunities for intergenerational leadership are really important to point out because sometimes, we especially in our work, we face stakeholders who say, but we do engage young people. And really getting people to the point where we make them understand that it's not just about engaging young people in the processes that you are already doing, because they don't want to be engaged that way. And if you do it that way, they're probably going to resist it. Really getting them to a point where they say, how do we do intergenerational leadership? How do we let go of some of the power and create processes where we think together about what needs to happen? So a few quick reflections about that and the opportunities we really need to platform to ourselves and to other stakeholders. The first is that intergenerational leadership, it connects young people's legitimacy to the institutions that are trying to work with them or work for them. We know that there's this narrative that young people should be engaged. And whenever you throw out youth is like the catchphrase like AI. Whenever you put AI on something these days, everyone thinks it's great. Everyone wants to be involved. It's the new buzzword. So youth has become a bit of a buzzword. And that has its downfalls, but at the same time, it has its benefits because then if you do use the ability to convene young people, the ability to bring them into a space, to draw the attention of the right kind of stakeholders, that is one of the value propositions that youth organizations, networks, youth philanthropy have, that they can convene a stakeholder group that is very difficult for many stakeholders outside of the youth space to reach. And so that value proposition needs to be very clear when we're working with non-youth stakeholders. And at the same time, if we can build that partnership authentically, older leaders within the philanthropic sector are able to then give access to things like the capital, the networks, and the influence for younger philanthropists or philanthropy networks to really thrive. So it's not about, young people going and asking for handouts. It's about establishing a mutually reinforcing value exchange between youth and older leaders. The second point is also it helps to shift the power without losing continuity. Sometimes we often think about it as youth need to be given a platform and we all need to listen to young people on everything. I think there's a lot of issues that young people cannot speak on, that we simply don't have the experience yet, or we don't have the exposure to speak on it in the right way. And so, what we're trying to platform here is that intergenerational leadership is not just, oh, yes, okay, we'll hand over everything to youth and they'll just do everything. Likely that's going to fail. It's about creating that continuity pathway between younger and older leaders through the mentorship, through the leadership channels, through breaking some of those glass ceilings where young people are just expected to be interns in the philanthropy sector for their whole lives, and then suddenly they must now take up senior leadership. There's that jump is much too large. The third point is also the quality of decisions. When different generations are involved, and this links into the previous point as well, they see different things because they've experienced the world differently. The world of the baby boomers hasn't completely left us. We know that the post-World War era, where it was nation state against nation state and governments were making unilateral decisions, is still very much with us today. We see it in the Trump administration. We see it in the way that Europe is now forced to think. Even Africa is being forced to think more in a nation state way, which is not traditionally how we think about governance. And that really shows that there is still validity in having people in the room who are older, who see risks differently. But it's about putting those different risk appetites, the different perspective into conversation with each other without anyone dominating another or being seen as the default. The fourth point is also it makes youth-led philanthropy more credible and fundable, and that links very much to the first point that when you have cross-generational leadership in your governance, your partnerships, in your funding models, it just signals credibility to both youth because they see themselves reflected, but also to older generations because they see their own peers involved. And so as young people, I think sometimes, whether it's in the philanthropy sector or other sectors, we struggle to create sustainable partnerships. We struggle to really involve other people in our work to the extent that they can take ownership because we feel we must have the ownership. And there's the sense of insecurity that if we give too much, they will take all of it. But that can be managed, and we need to find ways to manage that. The fifth point is that it builds a leadership pipeline, as I said, and this really prevents young people from falling into the short-termism. Gen Z is often accused of being more short-term. You know, you go into one job and then you don't like it, and then you jump to the next job and you jump to the next job. And other stakeholders or other age groups look at us and say, well, you know, you're just inconsistent. You can't commit. But when you speak to Gen Z, they have a vision for their career. They have a vision for where they want to go. And if that vision is not met, they understand that they're not going to spend, 5, 10 years at an organization which is not meeting their growth needs, which is not meeting their milestones that they've set for themselves. So it's in the interest of us as a sector, as youth philanthropy, to speak to non-youth philanthropy and say, look, the future of the sector is dependent on you being able to provide a pipeline, a career and a secure pipeline for young philanthropists or young people entering the philanthropy sector. Otherwise, you will find yourself in a few years without sustainable leadership. They will find themselves either leaving the philanthropy sector or leaving the social impact sector entirely and going into government or going into the private sector, which often happens. And that then reinforces the sixth point, which is ultimately it's about sustaining long-term impact for the sector. Because if the leadership is not intergenerational, if the work is not intergenerational, it is very time-bound and it will ultimately run its course. And then we'll lose a lot of the work that we've put in. There are a number of challenges that I quickly want to reflect on that prevent intergenerational leadership. I'm sure as I'm speaking, you're thinking to yourself, this is all great. I see the value. I'm seeing, the entry points, but there's so many challenges to actually having sustainable intergenerational leadership within philanthropy. And I just briefly want to touch on some of those before we go into what are some of the tools that we can actually use. And I'm also going to open up the floor to you guys if there are any points that are standing out to you that you see reflected in your own ways of working around intergenerational leadership. So the first is obviously youth are included, but they're not given real power. I think the amount of organizations I've now worked with that have youth advisory councils is actually a little bit embarrassing because oftentimes those youth advisory councils just become sort of appendages that have no real purpose. They're basically the wisdom tooth or the yeah, basically appendix of the organization. They're there, but we could cut them if we wanted to. And that's really a disservice to both the organization's ability to be intergenerational and also to the young people being involved. The second point harkens back to a point I made earlier around older systems that don't recognize how youth do philanthropy. There hasn't yet been a conversation around how should young people be engaged, how are they doing it. There is some research emerging now, but I think because people haven't necessarily seen the value, they're not really taking note of it in the way that they should. And that, I think, is on the youth philanthropy sector to signal those messages of where are the young people, how are they giving, how do they prefer to be involved in social impact work, and so on. The third is that there's too little investment in preparing young leaders. As I said, we can't expect youth to just enter a sector like philanthropy and feel that this is something they can navigate. Philanthropy is a very multi-stakeholder space. You're sort of moving at the intersection of the organizations working on the ground, the organizations and entities making the decisions, whether they be government or so on, other stakeholders like the private sector, like other international organizations. And so there's a lot of skills required to navigate philanthropy effectively. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, are we equipping the next generation of philanthropic leaders with those skills in a way that they need them, in a way that they can use? The fourth is tokenism, which I think is something that we're all familiar with, where you basically have symbolic youth participation to gain the credibility that young people have and that their participation has. But because young people are not dumb, they do recognize when there's tokenism. And in the best cases, what you can expect is they will disengage. And in the worst cases, they will actually remain engaged, but they will use your own tokenism against you or for their benefit in a way that doesn't really advance the outcomes of your project. So sometimes I work with clients and they say, well, we invited young people, but they decided to do X, Y, and Z instead of doing what we wanted them to do. And my response to that is, well, that's a design flaw. It's because they've recognized that what you want them to do is not really in their benefit, or it's not the way they want to be engaged. So, they're going to be opportunistic, and they're going to take hold of the opportunity in front of them in the way that they feel it's necessary. And then the last challenge is obviously institutional habits. That are no longer relevant, that organizations haven't undergone reflective processes. And this is difficult. And I'll touch on a few tools in a moment that help to reshape thinking. But change processes in an organization are really difficult. And so it's easy to say, yes, we have to be more youth orientated, or yes, we have to engage young people. Even if you're a youth philanthropy, to say we have to change the way we partner with non-youth organizations or create allyship. That actual change process, getting the team on board, building the strategy, is a difficult process. And so that's why the inertia of institutional habits that are completely out of date with modern needs just stay. And so it really is the role of the leadership to step in and say, we're going to have this period of discomfort, this period of change, putting ourselves in a difficult position to really question our assumptions, to actually come up with a new way of thinking. In closing for this, I just want to then rehash a few points of how do we overcome fragmentation within the youth philanthropy sector. I think, first of all, building strong intermediary platforms. And I mean, I see some of them here as well that I've mentioned here. The philanthropy support organizations that are not themselves giving the resources, but they are creating the ecosystem and nurturing the ecosystem to allow philanthropy, especially youth philanthropy, to flourish. So the African Youth Philanthropy Network, the African Philanthropy Forum, obviously for our region, and others, they play such a crucial role in doing the things that philanthropy is not able to do on its own or individually, but bringing everyone together. And that links to the second point, which is that helps philanthropy create shared language and shared agendas. And as youth philanthropy, I think there's an opportunity for the sector to come together and say, what's the language that is missing? What is the language we want other people to use? And what is the agendas we want to be known by? This, of course, links to point 3, which is that you need investment in coordination, because bringing people together and coordinating in this way requires resources as well. And so philanthropies who are interested in developing the ecosystem for their own benefit need to then invest also in the coordination mechanisms that allow that to happen. The fourth point is around building unusual allyship. I think, as with any sector, philanthropy can get very siloed to think in philanthropy. There's this word philanthropy. When we go into another space like business or government or CSOs, philanthropy tends to speak like philanthropy speaks, assuming that everyone knows what's being spoken about. But there's really this need to build authentic relationships with other stakeholders in other sectors, whether it be corporate, government, or NGOs, to understand how do they speak and how do they understand the world. This also links into building common evidence and learning systems. So understanding how we measure evidence across the board, especially when it comes to the organizations that philanthropy and youth philanthropy support, they don't always know what philanthropy wants from them. Because they might go to one and they want this, they measure impact this way, they go to the other one and they measure it in this way. And so within youth philanthropy, really setting down what are the evidence systems that work best and how do we standardize those across societies, across sectors in a relevant way. The last 2 points, 6 and 7, really link to each other. And it's about, first of all, anchoring our collaboration within African traditions. And this is really something that Gen Zs are particularly in our region and our country are rightfully focusing on, to realize that the philosophies, the systems, the processes that inform the way that we give and the way that philanthropy works and empowers other stakeholders doesn't need to come from Europe. It doesn't need to come from the US, that there are indigenous giving traditions that we should be leaning into and popularizing, so that there's also a greater sense of ownership for the philanthropy sector and the youth philanthropy sector in Africa and Southern Africa. And then the last point as well, linking it to the actual agendas that are happening in the region. For example, does SADC, one of the organizations I work with is the youth, it's sort of a youth branch of SADC itself, but does SADC have a philanthropy approach? Do they have a philanthropy strategy? Do they have a youth philanthropy strategy? Should youth philanthropy be engaging SADC, the African Union, other regional agendas to say philanthropy is an important stakeholder in making this agenda a reality? Youth philanthropy specifically needs to be part of shaping this agenda because of the demographic bulge that we are now experiencing in our continent. And so the intersection of youth and philanthropy is an agenda that we need to put on the region's table as they are discussing the different developmental agendas. I'm going to touch on this last point, and then I'll allow anyone to come in and point out something that maybe stood out to you or resonates. But without going into too much detail, the three systems that we use, or the three ways of thinking rather, that we use when we work with organizations, is design thinking, systems thinking, and futures thinking. Now, each one serves different purposes, and I'm sure we'll be able to share this with everyone who's attended. But each of these are established schools of thought for managing change in their own right. But obviously, as a consultancy, we're able to bring together the best parts of each of these tools and use them to help different organizations. Design thinking is about creating a product that is orientated towards the needs of the user. So whoever the user might be for youth philanthropy, whether it is the beneficiaries being served, whether it's the partners we're building relationships with, we need to adopt a design thinking methodology. And that in itself is an entire change process. The second one is systems thinking. If we want to overcome the fragmentation in any system or in any ecosystem, especially the youth philanthropy ecosystem, you have to take a systems thinking approach to realize what influences what, where is power located, how does power move and flow within the ecosystem. And that knowledge and that skill is something that I think many philanthropies overlook because they have so much power in and of themselves that they don't have to really think about who's connected to who. Everyone comes to them. But in terms of long-term impact, we really need to take an ecosystem approach. The last one is futures thinking, really framing out the scenarios that are possible for the world. And especially now, that's more crucial than ever because the world is changing so quickly. And so multiple scenarios become possible within a day. And so mapping those out and understanding how philanthropy and youth philanthropy should respond to those can become a rallying call and an agenda setting activity to really get people on board to overcome a lot of the fragmentation that we face. I think with that, it's a lot to cover in a very short amount of time, but thank you again, Zandile, for giving me the opportunity to share some insights and reflections. I think I'll hand over to you if maybe you want to open up to the floor, or I can open up to the floor, however you would like to do it.
Reon, please do open up to the floor. And I think we've got about 3 minutes left. So maybe one
Yeah,
input, but I
no,
also like to say thank you so much already for your time and input, and we'll do this again pretty soon. Thank you so much.
great, thank you. Any questions, Alex, as we're yeah, Tembekile.
Hey Reon, lovely to connect with you again. This was a brilliant presentation because it's stuff that we've been investigating as AYPN also. And I'll be quick because I know time's about to lapse. I think just questions, more prompts, more stuff for you and everybody to think on. When we say we're fragmented, who are we fragmented from? Is it each other? Is it the ecosystem? And are we coming at the fragmentation and at a point of what's the word? Do we feel entitled to be part of this big ecosystem? Is it coming from entitlement or belonging or yes? Number two, the old system is not working. We've seen it. It will not serve, particularly Africa. Gen Zs in Nairobi and in Senegal have showed us that there's a new way of doing stuff and it works. Should we still be considering the old system or should we start focusing on strengthening what currently is and what the new generations, what the current generations have started to pilot? And then number three, on the intergenerational partnerships. I love that because knowledge does have to be passed down, but there has to be a limit to the scaffolding of depending on the old guard because the old guard is also very blinker focused to a point. And so I think there's always the danger that as young people we try to then depend more on them, which then repeats the exact same system that we're trying to fight against or to rebuild. So yeah, these were just questions, prompts, and yeah, this was a really great presentation, and I'll take a lot from it and reach out also. Thank you, and thank you to Sandile for organizing this.
Thanks, Tembekile. Really, really impactful questions. Um, I maybe want to open up if anybody else wants to make a comment. Otherwise, I can respond to that, but I don't want to rob anyone of the opportunity to also make an input. Yeah, Faith is asking if we can share that. I'm sure we can also share the presentation. I'll share it with Sandile and he can share it with others. Yeah, Lebogang, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. I'm not sure if the previous question was addressed in this. It might, but I'm not sure. So I'm going to just ask a direct one in terms of whether other demographics when it comes to youth matter, such as um, class, race, just like the ideology, are they, from your perspective, do you see them as just because they're this generation growing up in such an environment? So let me put my camera on. It's not nice to not to a blank screen. Just in terms of like how they present themselves, is it just, do you see them as just that population, or do you or drill down to other demographics, especially class, and possibly race, how people have grown up, etc., etc. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Lebogang. I'll make some brief comments just in the minute and a half we have. These are very big questions, but if we time out, just I'll try to do my best. So definitely on the point you're mentioning, Lebogang, about issues of class, race, we need to be intersectional when we think about young people. This presentation was obviously very quick, so we couldn't really delve into that. But something when we look at the design thinking methodology, and I really encourage people to go look at that, the design thinking methodology is orientated towards designing initiatives that are rooted in the user. And the user, in this case, because it comes from the business sector, is the person who will be benefiting from this. And in that process, you really do realize how you have to design with the intention of, yes, you're dealing with young people, but also at the same time, race, class, those kind of things. So yeah, I definitely think it has to be, and it's about the processes and tools that we use. Tembekile's question also very, very big. Probably not going to get to all of it, but where we fragmented. I think within the youth sector, we are fragmented from each other. Youth philanthropy is fragmented within itself, and within philanthropy as a sector, there's fragmentation between different stakeholders. So we're kind of dealing with different levels of fragmentation. So I really love that you asked that question. And again, here, things like systems thinking become really important for unpacking where the fragmentation and the pain point is. and showcasing some of those best practices that you're mentioning from those countries. And in that, I think, should we bring along old people? Should we bring along the way that stuff has been done? We should, in the sense of for practicality, because ultimately change is a really slow process. And so if we want to bring everyone along, it's like that thing, if you want to go far, go together. And so if we